March 21, 1945, Okinawa, Pacific Theater. The wreckage was still smoking when Lieutenant Commander James Parker reached it. His boots crunched through volcanic ash and twisted metal scattered across the airfield at Yantan. The kamikaze had missed its target by 30 feet, cartwheeling into the dirt in a burst of flame that left nothing but fragments. Parker had seen dozens of crashed Zeros. He knew the weight of their engines, the thickness of their aluminum skin. But when he knelt beside a section of fuselage, something felt wrong. He lifted a panel. It was light. Too light. He turned it over in his hands, studying the grain, the texture. His fingers found the edge where fire had peeled back layers like pages in a book. Paper. Laminated wood pulp and fabric, pressed thin and hard as steel. Parker's chest tightened. He looked at the debris field with new eyes. The entire tail section, the wings, almost everything but the engine cowling and cockpit frame. "Sir, you need to see this." Petty Officer Raymond Cole stood 20 feet away, holding something that looked like a crumpled kite. It was a control surface, charred black along one edge but intact enough to read the construction. Layers of washi paper, bonded with rice glue and phenolic resin. Cole's hand trembled slightly. "This whole thing, it's made of paper." Parker stood slowly, the wind pulling at his uniform. Around him, mechanics and engineers were beginning to gather, drawn by the strange quiet that had settled over the crash site. Someone whispered that it couldn't be real, that paper couldn't fly. But the evidence was scattered at their feet, and the scorch marks on the runway told a different story. The plane had flown. It had carried a man and 500 pounds of explosives across miles of open ocean. And when Parker looked closer at the cockpit remains, he found something that made his blood run cold. No parachute harness, no ejection seat. Just a simple belt, a stick, and a small photograph tucked into a metal frame near the instrument panel. A young woman. A child. The pilot had known he wasn't coming back. By nightfall, Parker had requisitioned a tent and turned the crash site into a restricted area. Intelligence officers from Naval Technical Air Intelligence arrived within hours, their faces grim as they photographed every fragment. A captain from Washington pulled Parker aside and told him two things. First, this wasn't the only one. Second, they needed to know how many more were coming. The interrogation reports came through 3 days later. A captured Japanese engineer from Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, half-starved and shell-shocked, had talked. He spoke of a program called Oka, Cherry Blossom, a rocket-powered glider designed to be carried beneath a Mitsubishi G4M bomber and released within range of Allied carriers. No landing gear, no return fuel, just a Type 4 Mark I Model 20 rocket motor and a pilot with nothing left to lose. But the engineer had said something else, something that made Parker's hand shake as he read the transcript in the dim light of his quarters. Japan was running out of aluminum. The bauxite mines in the South Pacific were gone, the supply lines cut, so they had turned to wood, to bamboo, to paper. They were building aircraft from the forests, from the rice fields, from the very fabric of the nation itself, and they were building them by the hundreds. Parker spent that night walking the perimeter of the airfield, watching the stars and thinking about the photograph in the cockpit. Somewhere in Japan, someone had convinced that pilot that his death would matter, that flying a paper plane into a warship was an act of honor. Parker had seen the kamikazes before, the young men with thousand-yard stares climbing into their cockpits for the last time. But this felt different. This felt like desperation weaponized. The next morning, Parker received new orders. A reconnaissance flight had spotted something unusual near Kanoya Air Base in southern Kyushu. Strange aircraft lined up on hidden runways, covered in camouflage netting. Too many to count, too light to show up clearly on radar. The brass wanted eyes on the ground. They wanted to know what else Japan was building in secret, and they wanted someone who understood what they were looking at. Parker was on a transport plane by noon, headed north toward the enemy mainland. The briefing folder on his lap contained a single photograph taken from 30,000 feet. Blurry, pixelated, almost useless. But in the corner, barely visible beneath the trees, was the outline of something that shouldn't exist. A hangar made of paper and wood, large enough to hide a dozen aircraft, maybe more. As the plane banked over the East China Sea, Parker opened the folder again and stared at the image until his eyes burned. He thought about the pilot with the photograph, about the engineers working in secret factories gluing together weapons from rice paste and prayers, about what kind of war this had become. He didn't know it yet, but what he would find in Kyushu would change everything he thought he knew about desperation, about sacrifice, about how far a nation would go when it had nothing left but its own body to burn.
April 3, 1945. 15 miles northwest of Kanoya Air Base, Kyushu, Japan. Parker hit the ground hard, the parachute collapsing behind him in a tangle of silk and suspension lines. The forest was dense here, pine and cedar pressing close, the air thick with moisture and the smell of wood smoke. He'd bailed out 3 miles from the drop zone when his transport took flak over the coast. Now he was alone, somewhere in enemy territory, with nothing but a compass, a sidearm, and a mission that felt more like suicide with every passing second. He buried the chute and moved north, using the slope of the hills to guide him. By midday, he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in a forest, rhythmic, mechanical, the hiss of steam and the clatter of presses working in sequence. Parker dropped low and crawled the last 100 yards until the trees opened onto something impossible. The factory was hidden beneath the canopy, built into the hillside like a wound in the earth. Camouflage netting stretched between the trees, creating a false floor that would be invisible from the air. Beneath it, dozens of workers moved in organized chaos, assembling aircraft on wooden frames that ran the length of the clearing. Women and old men mostly. Some looked no older than 15. They wore headbands and simple cotton uniforms, their hands moving with practiced efficiency. Parker pressed himself against a moss-covered boulder and watched. The planes taking shape on the assembly line were unlike anything he'd seen. No metal skin, no rivets, just layered sheets of what looked like compressed paper stretched over wooden frames and bonded with steaming adhesive. The wings were thin, almost translucent where the light caught them, but they were shaped with precision, each one identical to the last. A supervisor walked past, barking orders. Parker didn't understand Japanese, but the tone was unmistakable. Faster, more. The war effort demanded speed. Near the far end of the line, a completed aircraft sat on a wooden dolly ready for transport. It was small, barely 15 feet long, with stubby wings and a blunt nose cone. The cockpit was open, exposing a seat that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of wood. No instruments, no radio, just a simple stick and rudder pedals. Parker's throat tightened. This was Oka, the cherry blossom. But seeing it here in this forest factory built from desperation made it real in a way the crash site never had. These weren't just weapons, they were prayers. Built by hand, one sheet of paper at a time, by people who had already given everything. He spent 6 hours watching, documenting what he could in a small notebook he kept in his jacket. The workers changed shifts at dusk, filing out in silence while a new group took their place. They worked through the night, lit with covered lanterns that gave off barely enough light to see. Parker counted 17 craft in various stages of completion. He watched them apply the paper skin, brushing on layer after layer of adhesive until it hardened like shell. He watched them test the control surfaces, pulling cables through wooden pulleys, checking for smooth movement. And then he saw the pilots. They arrived just before dawn, a group of 20 young men escorted by an officer in a formal uniform. They looked exhausted, their faces gaunt and hollow. But they stood at attention as the officer spoke, his voice carrying across the clearing in sharp, clipped sentences. Parker couldn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. These men were being prepared, conditioned, convinced that their deaths would save the Empire. One of the pilots broke formation, stepping forward to inspect one of the completed aircraft. He was young, maybe 22, with a thin mustache and eyes that seemed too old for his face. He ran his hand along the wing, feeling the texture of the paper, testing its strength. For a moment, his expression flickered. Doubt. Fear. But then the officer barked something, and the pilot snapped back to attention, his face hardening into a mask. Parker felt sick. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. He thought about the photograph in the cockpit back in Okinawa, about the woman and child who would never see that pilot again, about the 20 men standing in this forest clearing, preparing to climb into planes made of paper and fly them into oblivion. As the sun broke through the canopy, Parker began to crawl backward, moving slowly to avoid detection. He had what he needed, proof that Japan was mass-producing kamikaze aircraft from non-strategic materials, proof that the desperation was deeper than anyone had imagined. But as he retreated into the forest, something caught his eye. A second clearing, hidden deeper in the trees, larger, and inside it, something that made his heart stop. Aircraft that didn't look like Oka, bigger, sleeker, with jet intakes where propellers should be. Paper and wood, yes, but designed with a sophistication that suggested something far more dangerous than a suicide glider. Parker froze, his mind racing. If Japan was building jet-powered kamikaze aircraft from paper, the war wasn't ending anytime soon. And if these things could reach the carriers, if they could penetrate the radar screens and hit their targets before anyone knew they were coming. A twig snapped behind him. Parker spun, reaching for his sidearm, but he was too slow. The rifle barrel was already pressed against his spine, and the voice that spoke was calm, almost gentle. "American, you should not be here."
April 4, 1945. Interrogation Facility, Kanoya Air Base, Kyushu, Japan. The room was small, lit by a single bulb that swung gently from the ceiling. Parker sat on a wooden chair, his hands bound behind his back, his face swollen from the beatings they'd given him during transport. Across from him sat Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, a middle-aged officer with wire-rimmed glasses and a translator's precision in his English. He didn't look cruel. He looked tired. "You are fortunate," Tanaka said, pouring tea into 2 cups. "The soldiers who found you wanted to execute you immediately. I convinced them you might have intelligence value." He slid 1 cup across the table. Parker couldn't reach it. Tanaka seemed to notice and offered a thin smile. A formality. They sat in silence for a moment, the light bulb casting shadows that shifted with each small movement. Parker's mind was working through options, calculating chances of escape, survival, extraction. All of them hovered near zero. "You saw the factory," Tanaka said. It wasn't a question. "You saw what we are building. I imagine it troubles you. The idea that we would send our young men to die in aircraft made of paper." He sipped his tea. "It troubles me as well." Parker said nothing. He'd been trained for this. Say nothing. Give nothing. But Tanaka didn't seem interested in interrogation. He seemed interested in conversation. "Do you know why we use paper?" Tanaka continued. "It is not because we are primitive. It is not because we have abandoned technology. It is because we have nothing left. The Americans have taken our aluminum, our steel, our oil, our supply lines, everything. So we turn to what remains, our forests, our rice fields, our people." He paused, looking down at his tea. "We are building weapons from the body of Japan itself." Parker's jaw tightened.
That doesn't make it right. No, Tanaka agreed softly. It does not. But it is what we have. And the men who fly these planes, they believe they are saving their families, their nation. They believe their sacrifice will buy time, will convince the Americans that the cost of invasion is too high. He looked up, his eyes meeting Parker's. Are they wrong? The question hung in the air like smoke. Parker thought about the Allied casualty projections he'd seen in briefings, the estimates for an invasion of the mainland. Millions on both sides. The brass had been clear. Japan would fight to the last man, woman, and child. And weapons like Oka, built from desperation and flown by volunteers, were designed to make that fight as bloody as possible. The war is over, Parker said, roughly. You just don't know it yet. Tanaka smiled sadly. Perhaps, but until that moment comes, we will keep building, and they will keep flying. He stood, walking to the small window that looked out over the airfield. In the distance, a formation of aircraft was taking off, their engines roaring. Those are Nakajima Ki-115 Tsurugi, swords. Wooden fighters, built in 2 weeks, flown by pilots with 10 hours of training. They will not return, but they will fly. Parker felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, not physical, deeper than that. The kind that came from seeing too much, understanding too much, carrying too much weight. Why are you telling me this? Tanaka turned from the window. Because you are a witness, and when this is over, when the historians write their accounts, they will say that Japan was fanatical, barbaric, insane. And perhaps we were. But I want you to know that we were also desperate, that every piece of paper, every splinter of wood, every drop of glue represented a choice we made because we had no choices left. He walked back to the table and sat down. I want you to remember that war does not make monsters. It reveals what we are willing to become when everything else is taken away. The door opened. 2 guards entered, rifles ready. Tanaka said something in Japanese, and they hesitated. He repeated himself, more firmly this time. The guards bowed slightly and left. Tanaka pulled a small key from his pocket and unlocked Parker's restraints. You will be transferred to a POW camp tomorrow, Tanaka said quietly. The war will be over soon, perhaps in weeks, perhaps in months. You will survive, you will go home, and you will tell this story. He paused, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a small photograph. A woman, 2 children. This is my family. They are in Tokyo. I do not know if they are still alive. The firebombing. His voice broke slightly. He composed himself. When you tell your story, Lieutenant Commander Parker, remember that the men who built those planes, who flew them, who died in them, they had families too. They had photographs. They had reasons. Parker stared at the photograph, then at Tanaka. For a moment, neither man spoke. The light bulbs swung gently overhead, casting their shadows across the walls. I'll remember, Parker said finally. Tanaka nodded and stood. He walked to the door, then paused. The aircraft you saw in the second clearing, the jet-powered ones, they are called Kika, Orange Blossom. They will never fly in combat. We do not have the fuel. We barely have the pilots. But we built them anyway, because to stop building would be to admit defeat before defeat came. He looked back at Parker. That is what desperation looks like, Lieutenant Commander Parker. It looks like hope made from paper. The door closed. Parker sat alone in the room, the tea growing cold in front of him, Tanaka's photograph still on the table. Outside, the sound of aircraft engines faded into the distance. Somewhere, men were climbing into cockpits made of wood and paper, fastening their belts, checking their controls one last time. Somewhere, families were waiting, hoping, praying. Parker closed his eyes and saw the forest factory again. The workers moving in silence, the pilot standing at attention, the paper wings catching the light like moth wings, fragile and beautiful and terrible all at once. He thought about what he would write in his report, how he would explain what he'd seen, how he would make anyone understand that the enemy wasn't just soldiers and weapons, but a nation that had turned itself inside out, burning everything it had left to keep fighting one more day. When the guards came for him in the morning, Parker was still sitting at the table staring at the photograph. He picked it up carefully and slipped it into his pocket. A piece of evidence, a piece of truth, a reminder that behind every weapon, every strategy, every battle, there were faces, families, photographs tucked into cockpits. The war ended 4 months later. Parker survived the POW camp and returned home to Boston, where he spent the rest of his life working as a mechanical engineer. He never spoke publicly about the forest factory or Captain Tanaka, but in 1983, 2 years before his death, he donated his wartime journal and a single photograph to the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. The photograph showed a Japanese woman and 2 children, their faces solemn, their eyes looking directly at the camera. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written 2 words in Japanese, "Wasurenade kudasai." Please don't forget.